Well, we find ourselves once again about to enter into one of the most dreaded times every 2 to 4 years, and that is the election cycle. This time of year is always bound to present us with different extreme viewpoints on one side or the other, and sometimes extreme doesn't necessarily mean irrational. Sometimes extreme just means people who are removing all the necessary nuance to difficult situations that make it realistic. I actually used to be incredibly into politics, and it wasn't so much because I had one view or the other view that I felt super passionately that everybody should agree with. It was just because I liked the game of the thing. There's a part of me that kind of enjoys the idea of an argument. I appreciate a good dumpster fire, and if you love good dumpster fires, politics is full of plenty of them. And so I really got into it, but I found myself having to step away because it just became distasteful looking at the different individuals involved in these political debates who just kind of wanted to take everybody and say things have to be this way or they have to be that way. The idea of there being a compromise or a moderate position became something that fell out of vogue. It's actually something today that you can see both of our major political parties pushing back against. I know a number of individuals within the Republican Party are experiencing this right now, where they end up seeing some people within the party looking at individuals who are more moderate and then saying, well, you know what, we don't even need you in this group. We don't even need you associated with us anymore. You can see the exact same thing happening on the Democratic side as well, where there are individuals who over the last 4 to 6 years will say, didn't have sufficiently progressive views, and because of that, they were being told that they were part of the problem. In the midst of this rhetoric, you see this growing of a middle ground. You see this kind of centrist thing starting to come out, where there are people who are saying, I don't feel like I belong in one side or the other. And a lot of that is due to the fact that these two sides have just continued to become more and more and more and more and more extreme. There's actually a quote from the philosopher Nietzsche that a lot of self-described philosophical individuals like to quote. And Nietzsche would say that a extreme position is not countered by a moderate one, but by a contrary radical view. And this is what I think we end up seeing in our world, are people just becoming more and more and more and more and more extreme. And this has an implication on our spiritual lives, because what it actually causes is a situation where in order for us to fit in and to find a group of people that we feel like are accepting us, we end up having to push other people away. There's no longer a middle ground that you can sit in and be readily accepted by like-minded people, while at the same time keeping doors open to conversations with other people. You can see how that would harm your ministry to other individuals that maybe God is calling you to reach out to. Something that you end up seeing in Ecclesiastes is an appeal to a sense of moderation, but not necessarily moderation when it comes to politics or social issues. Instead, it's something that may sound a little odd. You see, Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes talks about not being overly righteous and not being overly wicked. And that sounds odd at first. Not be overly righteous? I mean, how can something in the Bible tell us to not be overly righteous? But when you look at really what it's talking about these individuals that become so righteous and so much of an icon of spirituality that they're just kind of unreachable. Like they're people that are very foreign to us, that we can't really relate to. Some Christians, with the best of intentions, will seek to mimic what they think a righteous individual should be, and in doing that, sometimes they actually push people away who end up being intimidated by the image of Christianity that they see in front of them. And then we don't really even need to go into detail about not being overly wicked. I mean, being an individual that obviously succumbs to the ways of the world means that you're no different than anybody else. So why would I have any particular interest in what you believe in? What you can see in either one of these is Solomon advocating that individuals appreciate what it means to have this sense of moderation. And so in your small groups in a second, you will read some of these scriptures and you'll go over a little bit about what it means to foster a moderate spirit. But I want you to think about this. As we sit here and we try to identify in more and more extreme ways with different subcultures of society, how might we actually be pushing people away? And in doing that, even if the world looks at us and says we're doing exactly what's expected, we are actually harming our ministry. Something I've joked about before is that I'm honestly not the biggest reader in the world, at least not of books. I read tons of things, but I read a lot of papers and things like that. But books are something I've always just had a hard time picking up and digging through, unless I find one that really captures me. And then I can't put it down. One of the ones that I always think of is this one David Platt wrote called Radical. And Radical is, as the name implies, basically going through what it means to have this radical sense of a relationship with God and how different your life will look if you are in fact living according to the precepts that Christ talks about during his ministry on earth, the things we see the apostles write about. It could be explained in a word as extreme, but is it really extreme? That's something I think is kind of fascinating, because when we talk about being moderate, a lot of individuals who like to latch on to the most charismatic, passionate parts of their faith will quickly point out and just say, well, what do you mean be moderate? We're not called to be moderate. We're called to be extreme in this world. But are we really? Something you end up seeing in the epistles, some of the ones that Peter wrote, is what it actually means to be quote unquote extreme. And it's really described more accurately as being separate. You're not really called to be extreme, you're actually called to be separate. And that's really what David Platt ends up talking about in this book. Not necessarily the distinction between extreme and separate, but you can see him describe what it means to live separate from the rest of the world around us. You see, the world wants us to take these extreme positions, and so what you're doing by looking at your life as being something that's guided by God and that's guided by the teachings of Jesus Christ is looking at it and saying, I'm not a slave to the extremes that the world tells me that I must subscribe to. Instead, I live for something that's better. I live for something that's different. I live for something that is separate from the rest of the world. And I think that this is fascinating because it actually leads to like an option number 3 when a lot of people want to say you either have option number 1 on this side or option number 2 on this side. This is one of the reasons why we end up seeing things in the Bible that talk about give unto Caesar what is Caesar and give unto God what is God's. And then you end up seeing, what you read here in a second, is how Peter explains that we are to be obedient to the powers of this earth, but allow our love to be something that actually causes us to be noted as being different. And once again, that's interesting because it looks very different than an individual doing what popular culture might consider being radical. What the world may say is radical is doing extreme demonstrations of your beliefs, or by acting in a way that individuals can't help but to take notice. And all these traditional forms of being extreme are things that the world has bluntly become accustomed to, because that's what everybody is doing. What we read about in the scriptures is a form of extreme that isn't actually extreme. It's really just that it's different, and that in being different, it is in fact something that many individuals will see as being radical, but really just indicates that we live for something so much better than the options that this world provides us with. In John 13, verse 34 and 35, we see Christ saying this, I give you this command, love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are to love one another. The world will know you by this, that you love one another. I think that that is something that is profound, because when you look at what Christ is saying, he's saying that people aren't going to know who you are because of your rhetoric. They aren't going to know who you are because of your demonstrations. They're not going to know who you are because of the stances you take on social and political issues, who you vote for, what your disposition is towards the government. The world is going to know you because they are going to see the one thing that is truly extreme about Christ, and that is his love. The Savior that we view as doing something that is so unexplainable in sacrificing himself so that we could have everlasting life is the same Christ who took very moderate, from a human perspective, actions, where the religious zealots came in and said, oh, well, this is how somebody who is religious is going to zealously follow the law. They're going to honor these different rules that we have established for the Sabbath and who you associate with. And in Christ, pushed all those aside and just said, no, I don't need to do that. At the same time, he looked at invitations that he had to push back against the government, and he said, no, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. Christ actually seems like an unremarkably moderate individual, except for one area, and it is that one area in which Christ also called us to be noted, and that is by his love. The one thing about him that was truly extreme. So as we sit here and we look at our own faith, we should take a little bit of comfort in knowing that the expectation is not that we're going to be some kind of extreme radical living on the fringes of society simply to be a demonstration of God's holiness or the extreme impact he has in our lives. That's not the point. The point is that we are going to be known by this extreme sense of love that we have for one another. A sense of love that comes with a degree of correction from time to time. A sense of love that believes in truth and wants people to have that truth because of how we love them, but love nonetheless. And so as you think about your own relationship with God, I would challenge you to ask yourself this: do I possess a truly radical spirit in the one area in which Christ demonstrated his radical nature, in his ability to love? That's our message that we have for you today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.